Just some time. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming along to Global Climate Change Week at UOW and for getting involved. It is my pleasure to be chairing this session, and I would now like to officially hand over to Trish, who will be kicking off Global Climate Change Week at UOW. Thanks so much, Trish, for your time.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's officially afternoon, and welcome to Climate Change Week. I'd like to start this session with an acknowledgement of country, noting how the changes of our climate are impacting our lands, waters and skies, and recognising the significance that Indigenous knowledges must play in the journey to healing our planet for future generations. Here at the University of Wollongong, we acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by this sacred landscape and intimate relationship with that landscape since creation. From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from freshwater to bitter water, to salt, from city to urban to rural. The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal people of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things. The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonialisation on our campus's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. And we recognise the sovereignty of First Nations people all around the world, and particularly where our campuses are based. Thank you so much for being here today. And what a beautiful day in Wollongong on Dharawal land to really celebrate the beauty of our world. And also the events of the next week are going to underscore the fragility. Perhaps the biggest challenge of our times is taking action to combat global climate change. And as we lead into the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow at the end of this month, there has been never a more important time to bring people together to accelerate action to address this issue. Global Climate Change Week was the brainchild of University of Wollongong academic Dr. Keith Norton, along with his fellow colleagues, transformed this idea into a global event. Global Climate Change Week has been an annual event at University of Wollongong for several years, and I want to thank Keith Norton, George Takacs, Helen Hansen, Helen McGregor and countless colleagues for their service and dedication to this work. I also want to acknowledge our amazing students who are holding a mirror to us to leadership and calling us to account for what we need to do. This year's theme is climate, health and action, an issue very dear to my heart. And this highlights the impact of climate on human and environmental health and looking at sustainable health practice, from eating healthily and sustainably to greening our health systems. And a much not recognised factor is that our health system contributes considerably to carbon emissions. And this year, although we are not able to run large communal events like tree planting and beach cleanups, we are marking this occasion by sharing stories, knowledge and ideas to raise awareness and help us to all make a difference. We'll have all seen from the political discourse over the last few weeks, this is an issue on everybody's minds. And so we have an opportunity to seize the moment and make a difference for our world and our future. I'm so grateful to see a jam-packed week of events where our wonderful teachers and researchers and students from across all of our facilities and campuses will share their ideas and insights. As I mentioned, I'm so excited that we'll hear from our students who have inspired us by taking action and who will be representing Australia at the UN Climate Change Conference of Youth. Our international colleagues will discuss their challenges in combating climate change from Dubai, Malaysia, and across the world. We will share with our community partners, including Wollongong City Council, and we are also honoured to host guest speakers, including Ed Burt, CEO of the Disability Trust and cycling climate warrior. I strongly encourage you to visit the UOW Global Climate Change Week webpage for a detailed list of events, activities, and resources. In today's session, we will tell you more about how the university is taking action. I'm so grateful for Professor Tim McCarthy for leading his expertise for this important initiative of the university. And I'm so glad that you'll hear from him today in his role as chair of the Sustainable Futures Committee, and from our student climate change action ambassadors, Grace Mahon and Ben Hamill. We'll also hear from one of the founders of Global Climate Change Week, Dr. George Takacs, who will talk to us about active transport solutions for the current climate emergency. And we will finish with a rundown of events you can engage with this week. Lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Belinda Gibbons for leading the charge on Global Climate Change Week this year, and also to thank each and every one of you for being part of Global Climate Change Week 2021. Sometimes this can seem daunting, and each of us can seem very minuscule in this huge task, but it's through collective action and power and commitment that we are going to make a difference in the world. And I really want to thank you so sincerely for all you are doing to advance the cause. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Belinda to MC this event and introduce our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Trish, for kicking off and for your time today. I don't think I've ever heard the word climate mentioned so much over the past few days, and not only because we've been with Nancy and Leah trying to organise this event, but over the weekend, just on every news channel, there's a lot being discussed around climate. And yeah, so it's just a very interesting space, a very hot topic, which is really, really important. So glad that we're kicking off the discussion this week alongside all the media that's surrounding the event. So first of all, we have the pleasure of having Professor Tim McCarthy with us today. Obviously the Director of the Sustainable Building Research Centre and also Director of our newly formed Sustainable Futures Committee. And we thought it'd be really lovely for everyone to hear about the committee and for just Tim to give us some insights into that. So thanks so much, Tim. I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Belinda, and thanks, Professor Davidson, for that introduction. I'm honoured to actually have been entrusted with running this committee, and I'm honoured that the work of this committee isn't just starting now. It's actually work that's been going on for quite some time, but maybe hasn't had the focus that the university needed. I'm deeply grateful to our student group to have actually done a lot of the legwork to help us set the agenda as we go forward. So let me tell you quickly about the Sustainable Futures Committee, what it is and maybe what it isn't. It's the follow-on from the Environmental Advisory Committee, which advised previous Vice-Chancellors about pretty much operational issues. But the Vice-Chancellor has worked with Kathleen Packer, and I acknowledge Kathleen's strong work in this, to establish the terms of reference for the Sustainable Futures Committee, to look beyond just operational issues and in fact cover all the aspects of the university. The QR code that you see behind me will actually link you to the terms of reference for the committee, so I won't go through those in detail. But I will say that what we've done so far is we have established 5 working groups to look at different aspects of sustainability across the university's operations. And those are listed on that website. But carbon neutrality is a particular one that I think a lot of people are interested in. And as we go forward, we need to look at when we achieve carbon neutrality, how we achieve it, and stress ourselves and change our behavior so that we get there faster than the rest of the community. Our second working group is looking at renewable energy. And there's a few things in there. One is the procurement of energy. As a university, we use a lot of electricity. And as Professor Davidson said, healthcare uses a lot of electricity. So we need to have I suppose, a clever way of procuring that. But there are also other things that we can do in terms of renewable energy. We do a lot of research on our campus around renewable energy. And we have a lot of staff and students who themselves are renewable energy champions. You know, they've got solar on their own houses and so forth. There are the things we can do as a university community. Our biggest task over the next, particularly 6 months, will be our engagement working groups activities, where we're going to do our community consultation to actually get the whole community on board with our proposed targets, make sure that those targets are achievable, justifiable, and cause a little bit of pain for us to go forward. I'll wrap up with the final two working groups. We've got a working group on policy, which is to look at how our committee can influence the policies that currently exist in the university and make sure that all the policies in the university are aligned with the UN SDGs. Now, last but not least is the working group on learning, teaching, and research. And here we want to make sure that our core business of learning, teaching, and research espouses the UN SDGs, that it's embedded in our curriculum, and that we make use of the research expertise across our campus and the learnedness across our campus to help deliver sustainable outcomes as we go forward. If you visit the website, there is an email link there, which is Environment Committee at UOW, or you can email me direct if you've got any questions, queries, and so forth. I'll probably finish there, let somebody else take the forum.
Thanks so much, Tim. If anyone has any questions, or please just pop them in the chat. Have you guys kicked off, Tim? Have you had your first meetings? Or
so we've had our first committee meeting, and at that committee meeting we established our working groups, and we are populating those working groups. They're about 90% populated now, and we expect that they're all going to start meeting in the next couple of weeks. The working groups typically go from 5 people to 10 people, depending on how many people have expressed interest and also the size of the task. And our next committee meeting is going to be in December, where we'll actually receive the first reports from each of the working groups.
excellent. No, that's really exciting. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks, Tim. A lot of people talk about Grace and Ben, and I believe they were superstars on ABC Illawarra Breakfast this morning. So we'll be excited to get a copy of that recording and pop it up on our Global Climate Change Week site, as well as a resource for everyone. But yeah, we just thank you for all your efforts and all your time. And we asked Grace and Ben along today just so I know there's been a lot of, I guess, news articles and reports about Youth on Climate Change Conference, but just to give us a bit of background of where this kicked off and where you're up to along this journey. Plus, it's week 12, so I'm assuming you're probably skipping class or something to be here. So thank you so much for your time. I'll hand over to you guys.
Thanks, Belinda, and thanks for inviting us to present today. I'll just share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yes, thanks, Grace.
All right. Hand it over to Ben to do the introduction.
You might be on mute, Ben.
Ben, you're on mute.
There we go.
Apologies, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, got you.
Sorry, I'll start again.
It's all right.
Yeah, I'd like to really thank you, Belinda, for inviting us to talk about our project today. And I'd really like to say that the project wouldn't have been possible without the level of support provided by the university. I think that really comes through in the project and the real collaborative effort that it was. So I'll talk a little bit about the project. I'll talk about some of the consultation that we undertook, as well as the commitments that did emerge, and I'll hand over to Grace to talk about some of the demands that really made up the bulk of the project. So for our project, we were submitting an institutional statement to the upcoming Conference of Youth, which is the precursor to the Conference of Parties. So within this statement, as I said, we undertook a range of consultation to really make sure that the sentiments in the statement echo the sentiments of youth within the university, as well as the broader Wollongong community as well. So I'll get Grace perhaps to talk, to the benchmarking that she undertook, that we all undertook.
Yep, so as part of our preparation for the statement, we did extensive benchmarking in the Australian university sector to sort of see where UOW could improve in its sustainability management plans. And we identified 7 categories for the benchmarking, which were emissions, electricity, transport, waste, buildings, biodiversity, water, and procurement. And we did a lot of qualitative and quantitative benchmarking there to see what the sector was doing as a whole, but also the innovative initiatives that were run by individual universities. And we also did benchmarking on teaching and learning and research, and this was sort of more qualitative analysis of what individual universities were doing and how UOW could sort of improve its stance here. So now on to the consultation, and I'll hand it back over to Ben.
So after that initial benchmarking, that really formed a robust foundation for what our statement would look like. But again, we wanted to make sure that our statement was fit for purpose for the University of Wollongong and for the Wollongong community. So as part of that, we undertook 9 discussion groups over 3 days amongst staff, students and community groups. And we tried to really look to have a broad level of representation across those 3 demographics. And that really formed a big part of the COI project requirements as well. And a really big part of this consultation was consulting with Facilities Maintenance Division and Kathleen Backer to really make sure that the commitments that we put forward were feasible and actionable within the timeframes that we proposed. So following this consultation, 5 broad commitments came up. So the big one was working towards carbon neutrality by 2030. That was something that was certainly echoed across staff, students and community members, that the university needed to take a really broad stance there. And that's something that we're certainly working towards within the Sustainable Futures Committee, and I'm really excited to see what carbon neutrality looks like within the University of Wollongong, what scopes we decide to engage with for carbon neutrality. And I think that as an institution, we play a really important part in setting the example for good practice as an educational institution, especially putting our best foot forward and setting a really good example for other organisations and other institutions to follow. The second commitment that we came up with was improving energy management within the university. That was another aspect that was certainly identified, that the university could be more efficient in its use of energy. So a really large component of improving energy management at UOW was engaging in a renewable power purchasing agreement, so buying renewable power, and that perhaps is something that could fall within the net zero commitment as well. The next commitment after this was supporting sustainable transport. So this is quite a broad commitment that we really looked to implement. And it's certainly something that's reflected across other universities within the sector. So transitioning the vehicle fleet to electric and hybrid vehicles, increasing the electric vehicle charging capacity, and really ensuring that we're working with local government to make sure that the building of new car parking spaces is done in a way that is still encouraging public and active transport and not encouraging students to drive or staff to drive, given that quite a large majority of students and staff live in a close radius to the university. A really big aspect of this as well was investigating an air travel emission offset target of 100%. So offsetting air travel emissions that occur through travel. Certainly not something that is happening at the moment as everything's grounded, but moving forward as we do get back to normal, that's something that it would be great to see the university implement. And not only institutional commitments, there's also student commitments, the commitments that we as individuals need to make in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. So a really big one is engaging in active and public transport solutions where practical. Another commitment that was identified that I think Professor McCarthy also mentioned was really cultivating the research excellence at the university. We have a wealth of research at the universities, especially within the sustainability area, and it would be great to see that information, that wealth of information and experience really coalesced, so that UOW becomes a global leader in the climate change space. And our final commitment was looking at educating the community. So not only is UOW an educational institution for the students and people that attend, it's also a really important institution within the Wollongong community, and as such plays such an important role in really raising the profile of climate change and the importance of sustainable practice for community members. And I think the Global Climate Change Week is such a great exercise in doing that. So part of this commitment was not only educating the staff and students and implementing a micro-credential like Climate Hero to really increase that understanding of climate change and sustainable practice, but also really have a lot of community outreach. So I'll now hand over to Grace to look at some of the demands that we identified.
Thanks, Ben. So I'll briefly discuss the demands that we made towards broader decision makers in our statement. So we separated these into 4 levels, which was individuals, institutions, local government, the Australian government, and the global community. And we placed the greatest emphasis on the Australian government, because obviously the local government council is doing a fantastic job in this space, and individuals can do so much, but the Australian government, it's a very poignant time to make a demand to the Australian government for further action. And we called for a robust climate change strategy, and we want a commitment to carbon neutrality by at least 2050, with interim targets so we can track our progress, and also a solid plan to get there. So a decarbonisation roadmap for every sector. And then with our global demands, we also talked about how the global community really needs to be global citizens and prioritise climate action by engaging in climate financing to assist developing countries. So developing countries are disproportionately impacted by things like climate change disaster and climate change related displacement. So being able to have climate financing mandates that countries can stick to is really important, and this is on the agenda for the COP26 conference. So our steps forward with the statement: after we made the university statement, we presented 2 educational webinars which were provided to students, and this is where we communicated the findings and the content of our statement, and we also had guest speakers present. So we had a few academic staff members, and we also had local policy makers present about the importance of climate action. And this statement fulfilled all the requirements for the Climate Hero recognition, which also required 2,500 signatures. And I think we achieved 3,600 signatures, which was well above what we needed. And the team also contributed to the Australian statement. We were the only institution to make a submission to the Conference of Youth and be successful. So we played a really large role in forming this Australian statement, which is ultimately going to go to Glasgow and will form the Global Youth Statement, which is really exciting in the lead up to COP26. So yeah, it's great. Thank you for letting us present today.
Thank you so much. When I hear you guys speak, I always feel better about the world. Just for a few minutes. Thank you so much. I know we all appreciate Grace and Ben's time and all their efforts. I think our government could have used your help over the weekend. And still needs your help. You might get a call up. Who knows? Do you guys get to head over to COP26? Obviously, maybe not at this time, but is that a goal of yours? Tell me a bit about your backgrounds. Like, what do you guys study?
I'm doing an economics major alongside UOW's management cadetship. And yeah, I'm really interested in climate financing and climate economics. I'd love to do my master's in it at some point overseas maybe. So yeah, we'll see what happens in the future. We're so undecided though.
Sounds great. What about you?
Yeah, I'm studying a Bachelor of Psychology. I have a background in working in mental health, but this has really been an area of passion for me. And you certainly see the overlap between climate change and the future of our planet and the sort of anxiety that it invokes in people. So I think it's really important that we have some really decided action over these next months and years.
No, that's wonderful. And wonderful that you're a really interdisciplinary group as well, and to be able to see climate through all those different lenses, which is wonderful. So thank you so much for all your efforts and for being here with us today. If anyone's got any questions for the guys, please just pop it in the chat and they can answer them on the chat. Interesting that one of the areas that you both talked about was active and public transport and sustainable transport, especially one of your target areas for UOW. And we're really fortunate today to have George with us, and George is going to have a chat about active transport. And I know George is a physicist and a climate activist, bushwalker, and if you follow him on Twitter at all, you'll be kept very much up to date with everything that's happening in the climate space. And I had the fortune of being involved in Global Climate Change Week with George and Keith over the past few years. And they're just such wonderful people and such passionate people. And I know they'll be very proud of you as students in this space and what you've been able to achieve this year. But we're really fortunate to have George with us to have a bit of a chat about his latest project on active transport. So thanks so much for your time, George. I'll pass it over.
Okay, thanks very much, Belinda. And I'd like to echo the comments that you've made about Grace and Ben and their fantastic work. And I'd like to thank them for the leadership that they're showing. But I'd also like to thank you, Belinda, for the leadership that you're showing and have shown around the SDGs over so many years here in Wollongong. And I'm really looking forward. I heard Patricia Davidson refer to you before as Dr. Belinda Gibbons, but I'm looking forward to the day when I can address you as Professor Belinda Gibbons. Hopefully it's not too far off. I'd like to also thank Tim, though, for his for taking on the role of chair of the Sustainable Futures Committee. It's got some very important work to do. And I hope one of the things that they can look at is this issue of active transport. So I've got a presentation, so I might just share my screen, Belinda, and go to that presentation. And hopefully I'll get it right.
Beautiful. Thanks.
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about is the role that active transport can play in addressing the climate emergency. And by active transport, I mean cycling, walking, and other forms of what you might refer to as micro-mobility. So that could be using scooters, skateboards, and electric versions of all of those. So I want to first of all give this some context by looking at some of the numbers around the climate emergency. And so the first thing is the current global emissions of carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels primarily is around 40 billion tonnes a year. That's 40 gigatons. And in the latest IPCC report, they pointed out that the carbon budget now for limiting warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, if we want a 50% chance of achieving that, we can from now on emit no more than another 500 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. So if you think about some of the implications of that, you can think about what does that mean in terms of time. If we keep emitting at the current rate, that carbon budget's exhausted in 12.5 years. And of course, hopefully we won't keep emitting at the current rate. But you can think about that in per capita terms as well, and global equity. So the 7.5 billion people on the planet, divide that 500 billion tonnes of CO2 up amongst them, that gives us each a carbon budget of about another 67 tonnes of carbon dioxide. And here in Australia at present, we're emitting about 22 tonnes per person per year. So in a way, our carbon budget, if we're to emit equitably around the world, is going to be exceeded here in Australia in 3 years. So that really, I think, helps to drive home that this really is an emergency situation we're facing. Now, in the lead up to COP26, there's a lot of talk about net zero by 2050, and I'm trying to get people to stop talking about net zero by 2050 because there's a couple of problems with that. And the main one is that it doesn't take into account the carbon budget. You can become zero emissions in 2050 and well exceed that carbon budget of 500 gigatons. So this graph here shows you 3 different emissions trajectories between now and 2050, 2 of them which meet the carbon budget of 500 gigatons and 1 of which doesn't. So the first one is, say, the one here in blue, which is a very simplistic way of reducing emissions where we reduce by the same amount each year until we get to zero and not exceeding the carbon budget of 500 billion tonnes. So what's important is the area under this curve here is 500 billion tonnes, and any other pathway to net zero has to, if it's not to exceed that carbon budget, have the same area. So the other 2 curves I've got here are ones that start off by initially assuming that for the next 5 years, our emissions continue to increase globally at about the same average rate as they had for the last 5. And that's about around 1% per year. Then they peak in around 2025 and then start to drop. The orange curve gets us to zero by 2050, and the rate at which we reduce emissions everywhere along that path is actually greater than the rate at which we're currently increasing them. And there's some implications around that. What that means is that we'd be retiring assets which consume fossil fuels at a greater rate than we are currently building them.
Hey, sorry, George. I don't think we can see the graph that you're talking about at the moment.
Oh.
Are you changing slides, George?
I am, yeah.
Hang on.
Let me just stop sharing then.
Yeah, you might have shared the window instead of the screen, and so we were locked to that window.
Yeah, okay. So let me, if I go to this one.
Perfect.
Can you see the graph now?
Yeah. Can you change slides though now?
Yeah. And what happens?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. That's,
okay. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
Okay.
I just thought it was my eyesight. I was like, oh, I can't see that curve.
Well, with this graph here then, so the important thing is here we've got 2 trajectories, each of which are net zero by 2050, but only one of those meets the carbon budget and of 500 gigatons, and that's this one here in black, which has in it a period in the coming decade where we reduce emissions very rapidly indeed. And whereas this orange one, which actually has quite rapid emissions reductions compared to the rate at which we're currently increasing them, doesn't meet the carbon budget. And when you look at the increase in emissions at present, to increase those emissions, we have to be building things to burn more fossil fuels. So the fact that the orange curve doesn't meet the budget implies that the rate at which we need to be building things that are zero emissions so we can retire existing infrastructure is much greater than the rate at which we're building new fossil fuel infrastructure at present. So that's quite a big challenge. And the implication of that is we need to look at things where we can reduce emissions without requiring a significant investment infrastructure. And I think that's where active transport comes into it. So the climate emergency, I like to say, is an infrastructure and investment emergency. And so the points that are important in that are that when you look at the existing devices that exist for burning fossil fuels, if you didn't build any more and simply use those till the end of their design life, that they would burn or put more CO2 into the atmosphere than the current carbon budget, right? So we're already in a situation where without building more assets, we're going to have to strand some existing assets. And if we build more, then we just make failure more likely and we end up with a greater pool of stranded assets. So when we're looking at reducing emissions, if we want to meet this carbon budget, the rapidity of the emissions we need to make means we need to look for opportunities to reduce emissions without having to build things which themselves have embodied emissions. So a good example of that is if you, when you're building renewable energy, there's embodied emissions in all of that. And so that's necessary, but it's not the fastest way of reducing emissions because you have an emissions payback period before you start to achieve the savings. So we need to look for these opportunities for rapid and significant emissions reductions, and active transport, I think, provides such an opportunity. And to just highlight why that's significant, I just want to go through then what's happening with emissions in Australia. So this slide here, and hopefully you can see it, there's a table at the top which shows you the percentage of Australia's emissions at present which come from the different sectors. So electricity dominates and it's nearly twice as high as transport. But when you look at what's happened since 1990, and that's shown in these two graphs, the orange curve shows you what's been happening with electricity emissions as a measure of the percentage increase since 1990. So by about 2009, electricity emissions were more than 60% higher than they were in 1990. But then they started to drop, and they've been dropping ever since. When you look at transport, transport also rose to more than 60% above 1990 emissions, and they only dropped when we entered this pandemic period. So this drop here is nothing to do with a long-term change in behaviour or a long-term change in technology. It's simply a consequence of the pandemic. And when we return to pre-pandemic conditions, these emissions will continue to go up. And at the current rate, before 2030, transport would become the dominant source of Australia's emissions. And that's a situation which is actually true in America today. And so it's the situation we're trying to avoid. When you look at our transport emissions, interestingly, the majority of them are from short trips in private passenger vehicles. 62% of our emissions come from private passenger vehicles, and short urban trips dominate in that. And it's short urban trips that can be readily replaced with active transport options. So with active transport, cycling and walking and so on, if you're going to go more than a kilometre or two, cycling is probably the preferred option for most people because it still offers significant time savings. The nice thing about cycling investment, there's low upfront costs to the user, so you don't have to buy an electric vehicle. It's accessible to people who can't drive, and that's a significant proportion of our population. In fact, the proportion of our population who can't drive is actually higher than the proportion of our population who don't have the capacity to ride a bike. And for example, you've got all the people who are under 16 who don't have a driver's license, and then there's a lot of older people who can't drive for various reasons. The infrastructure cost to support this transport change is quite low, and it's very rapid to roll out. And I've used there the example of Seville, where in the city of Seville, in a 4-year period from 2007 to 2011, they increased the trips by bicycle into their CBD from 7,000 trips a day to 70,000 a day, a 10-fold increase in less than 4 years. So you can get quite rapid change. Cycling is also the most energy efficient form of land transport we've got. And just some figures there on a recent bike ride, I looked at the data from my smartwatch. I ended up using 75 kilojoules of energy per kilometre. That's from my body metabolising energy sources. An internal combustion engine gets around 3,125 kilojoules per kilometre. So it's about 40 times the energy usage per kilometre of a person riding a bicycle. And even a battery electric vehicle uses about 10 times more energy per kilometre than a person riding a bicycle. So it's the most energy efficient form of land transport. It's also space efficient. When you look at the number of people you can transport per unit time in a standard 3.5 metre wide traffic lane, this graph here, this schematic shows you can get about 2,000 people per hour in a car at the standard levels of occupancy, but you can get about 14,000 people per hour on bicycles in that same 3.5 metre wide traffic lane. So land use is highly contested in our urban areas, and we need to look for more efficient ways of achieving all the things we need from that land. Transport is a very important thing, and cycling is much more efficient use of that land for transport than cars. The other thing about the bicycle is it's very low resource use to build the bicycle. It's about 10 kilograms compared to a 2,000 kilogram car, so 200 times fewer resources need to go into it. And as Rob Stokes, our state planning minister, said recently, the problem with an electric car is at the end of the day, it is still a car. So there are a lot of co-benefits as well that come from active transport, and these are probably better known to some of the other people that will be speaking later this week. But active transport leads to reduced levels of air pollution. Air pollution from internal combustion engine vehicles is linked to dementia, it's linked to heart disease. There's a whole host of other things that it's linked to. And by changing from motor car dominated transport to active transport, we'll also get greater physical activity levels. And that helps to reduce some of the increasing problems we've got in our society with heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and other metabolic disorders. A lot of social benefits from active transport. It's more equitable, people interact more, it creates a better sense of community, and then you also get reduced noise pollution, which has a whole host of other benefits that go along with that. And just to bring this close to home here at the end, here's some charts from a recent transport report that was done for the UOW. It's a few years old now, by the consultant firm AECOM. All these bars here represent the, or show the proportion of trips undertaken by different modes of transport for different categories. There's the bars come in pairs. There's one for students and one for staff, distances less than 3 kilometres. Then there's another pair for travelling 3 to 7 kilometres, students and staff, 7 to 10 kilometres, and then greater than 10 kilometres. The blue parts of the bars are the percentage of trips undertaken by car. The green is that undertaken by public transport, and the orange is that undertaken by active transport. And you can see for trips less than 3 kilometres, for staff, 56.8% of those work trips that are less than 3 kilometres are taken by car, whereas for active transport, it's only 28.4%. So staff are twice as likely to use a car to come to work less than 3 kilometres as they are to walk or ride, and that certainly needs to change. Students are much more likely to use public transport in just about every distance category than staff, which is quite an interesting feature, I think. But even when we get out to 3 to 7 kilometres, which is still a very cyclable distance, 7 kilometres, you're talking still, 15 to 20 minutes. We only find 11.8% of staff now are using active transport, and 80% of them are coming in the car. So there's a lot of scope for shifting people. Basically, what we need to do is to shift all these blue bars and colour them orange, and then we will be where we need to be. So the final slide, just to summarise, is in the context of a climate emergency, investment in active transport is the right type of investment we need to make. It's a low cost investment. It has low embodied energy and emissions, which means there's a very low emissions payback period before you start to realise real savings. You get those transport emissions down very quickly. It's energy and resource efficient, so it doesn't put a lot of other strain on the environment. It's task efficient in that it's a very effective way of moving large numbers of people relatively short distances in urban areas, much more efficient than cars. You reduce a lot of these negative externalities that come from motor vehicles. You improve health. And then finally, we can ask ourselves, just looking to the north of this campus, is a $280 million new state government investment in the northern interchange into this campus the best transport investment we can make in the context of a climate emergency? Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks so much, George. I could personally listen to you all day. So informative and just so much to take in. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you again, George. I don't know if you've got any questions in the chat there. I was just going to ask, are you working on any projects on active transport in our region? Like, do you work with Wollongong City Council or Healthy?
Well, I'm sort of working in an informal pro bono role with Healthy Cities Illawarra and advocacy for active transport. And as part of that, I'm engaged with a group of other individuals we've formed a little network and we communicate via Slack. We're looking at what we can do to lobby state and local government to improve active transport amenity in the Wollongong area. In fact, we've got a meeting this coming Saturday. And interestingly, quite a few of those people themselves are, one of them is a transport planner with Sydney City Council, but she lives in the Wollongong area. And she's responsible for the planning the bicycle network in Sydney City Council area. And we've also got another person who's acting as a transport consultant for a private consultancy firm as well. So there's a lot of expertise that we've got in there, in that little group. So hopefully we can make some change. But I think it would really help if the university worked with Wollongong City Council on the development of an active transport strategy for this campus and then sought state government funding for it. I think the state government is in a position at present where they're talking a lot more about active transport, and they're likely to be having pools of funds available for people who've got infrastructure projects to increase active transport.
Excellent, that's great to hear. I'm sure Tim is writing that down as we speak. Thanks so much, George. I realise, yeah, I want to let you guys go a little bit earlier before the hour. I know we are all very zoomed out at the moment, but really thank you for everyone's time. Again, these sessions are recorded, so we'll pop them up in our resource so you can refer to them later, or some of the information that was presented. I'm just going to share with you what we've got planned for the rest of the week. I guess neither Nancy, Leah or myself are climate scientists, but we are definitely very passionate about this space. And so our role is to bring those with the knowledge together, as varied as all those disciplines are. So for the rest of today, I guess we have a really international panel. So we have our Dubai, Malaysia and Hong Kong campuses coming together to talk about climate in their cities and the action that they're taking. And we're really fortunate this week to have some of the Wollongong City Council projects that are being presented. And you'll see those running throughout. So tomorrow we have the lovely Professor Karen Charlton, who's giving us a live cooking demonstration where she's sourced all her food locally from Planetree, and also give us an insight into the UOW community gardens, which have just kicked up again, which is lovely. We'll have some panels on sustainability impact in our region on Wednesday, and Business and Law have a climate hour, and on Thursday we have a special webinar with Ed Burt, and Ed's going to be discussing disability rights in the climate change effects on the disability sector, and also how bicycles can create change. And obviously Ed was the solo rider for 5,000 Ks across Australia, so really looking forward to that webinar. And then on Friday we've got some great initiatives shown by the Sustainable Building Research Centre. And then we'll come back with George to close us off on 12 o'clock on Friday, talking about electrifying our household and batteries and solar and all that goodness. So yeah, unless there's any last questions, really thank you for everyone's time today, for all your insights, and hopefully we will see you online throughout our other sessions. Thanks everyone.